Thank you, Sydney, for being here. Super excited to talk to you. Here at Power to Fly, we really believe, in fact, we have a speaking series on this subject called Pride All Year Long. So we don't want our Pride just to be in June and just have, talking about the very important issues. Then we really want it to be 365. So thank you so much for being here today. And I'd love for just kind of kick off, if you could just tell us a little bit more about yourself, your background, and how you got into this amazing work.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Power to Fly, for having me. And thank you, Rob, for having this conversation. Super excited to be here, talk about the work that we do, and hopefully connect some people to some resources that might, help you take that next step in whatever kind of career you're looking for, that will be as empowering as it can be. So yeah, looking forward to this conversation. Feel free to submit any questions. Happy to engage with you all as much as you're willing to engage with me. So as mentioned, I'm Sydney Perry Anderson, she, her, or they, them pronouns. I am coming to you from Philadelphia here at the Science Center. If you're ever in town, it's a wonderful place. But as mentioned, I'm with the Greater Philadelphia Region LGBTQ+ Chamber of Commerce, the Independence Business Alliance, which covers 5 counties in Pennsylvania, 5 counties in New Jersey, and 1 in Delaware. And we are almost 20 years old as a Chamber of Commerce. But as mentioned, the TransWork program is closer to 5 years old, though the idea began a little bit before that. I'll get more into our program history in a little bit, but I can speak a little bit more about myself. I grew up here in the city of Philadelphia, was very lucky to have some wonderful connections and super, healthy, loving, wonderful exposures to queerness at a young age, and have always been a very queer person, even though I only started publicly identifying as trans a handful of years ago. I've always been super queer and involved with this kind of work. So it's always been my passion and something I've kind of seen myself moving towards, whether it was service providing at a nonprofit organization or doing some other kind of work. I honestly didn't anticipate that I would be saying I work for a Chamber of Commerce, but mostly because I didn't know what a Chamber of Commerce was. And it turns out that we have a ton of really good resources for people. So again, I'll get more into that later. But I went to college in St. Louis. I studied women, gender, and sexuality studies. And while there, I was able to be the research and administrative assistant for the gender studies department and get exposure to and work with a huge variety of topics related to like gender inequality, racial inequality, a huge variety of, the list. I could spend this whole session talking about that work, but it really made it clear to me that for me to, wake up passionate about the work that I do every day, it was going to be, something I had to be passionate about. Not to be redundant there, but I, had a number of random jobs in retail and other things that, they paid the bills while I was, going through college and other things like that earlier in my life, and a nice summer job to have. But for me, I really wanted something I was going to be passionate about, I could really engage with and see that kind of long-term career with, so that I'm actually excited to come up with some kind of a 5-year plan in this role where I wasn't really before. So I'm really happy to now be in this kind of a role and be able to do the work that I do and work for my community. TransWork, again, we'll get into our program history in a moment, but we have the very broad goal of economic justice for our community. That is what our founders set out. And that can be really daunting at times, but it's also super inspiring because it really means that I have to say no to very few people, and pretty much anything, can be brought in as an important part of this program. So we are constantly expanding and growing towards new things, and really, everything's related to economic work and economic empowerment, from healthcare to, a huge number of other things. Again, trying to stay focused. And So it's really, really wonderful. We're able to build out a network of amazing organizational partners and all of, the wonderful things I'll get into now, I guess. So
yeah, no, I mean that's great, and I think you hit the nail on the head in that so many of the people I think listening want that kind of economic representation. They want to have that passion with what they're doing. They want a career. They just don't want a job. They want something that really feels enthusiastic to get up in the morning to do. And it's so great that y'all are doing that. And a few years ago, I also got to speak with the New York City LGBT Chamber of Commerce. And I think it's a great asset, an under discussed asset out there for LGBTQ people to really tap into. So great that you're here talking about it and representing it and spreading the word. Before we go into kind of some of the things that TransWork is doing, I just wanted to kind of take a step back too and talk, the uncomfortable or serious conversation too of what's happening in the United States right now. Here at Power to Fly, we did a talk a couple months ago about with Marty Cummings, the LGBTQ activist, about some of the drag bans that are happening, the anti-trans legislation that's unfortunately happening in many of the states here. So seeing, Sydney, could you talk a little bit about what's happening in the United States right now in terms of political and social attacks on trans people and trans rights?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a hard conversation to have. And so I apologize in advance for that. And I know some of these things can be triggering. I'll do my best to avoid some things, but unfortunately, this is a real component of what we're dealing with and a real, thing that I have to think about every day in terms of my own personal safety and the safety of everyone we work with and the confidentiality of everything that we do. And so it is absolutely crucial. So 2023 is, we're 9+ months into the year now. And so 3/4, we'll call it, of the way through, we've already seen a record number of anti-trans and anti-LGBT bills introduced across the country throughout state legislatures as well as at the federal level. This is the 3rd or 4th record-setting year in a row. It's really been devastating. I honestly don't have words for it as someone who started following and writing and researching about this topic 3 or 4 years ago. It was like, there's a record happening. We should all push the panic alarms. And there was this little bit of response. And now in 2023, it's worse than it's ever been. And some of our allies are stepping up in louder and prouder ways than they ever have before. And a lot of our allies are kind of shying away and, maybe we could say burnout or whatever it is, but it is really, really hard to see our opponents not stopping and a lot of people who claim to be allies kind of shying away from really stepping up to oppose this legislation. And so we've seen over 560 bills introduced across the country in 49 states, I believe is the current number, 32 bills at the national level. These would variously impact trans people's ability to receive healthcare, education, legal recognition in a variety of ways, other fundamental rights that, we kind of at least claim to depend on in the American system. It is true that most of these laws have not passed their respective legislatures, which is great. Many have. I think it's 80 or 90 that have passed at this point. We've seen a huge number of attacks kind of correlated with this social and political anti-trans movement as well. When anti-trans rhetoric and discussions become so prominent and our rights become something, not even our rights, but our fundamental lives and identities become something that is up for debate in state legislatures and other things, and it becomes a very politicized issue. I'll kind of skip over a couple details in this process, but it often turns into really immediate violence and people are dying. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but that is a huge part of what being trans in this country is right now and being trans across the world is. And so receiving healthcare, having legal recognition, accessing education, public accommodations of other sorts are so like fundamental from like an individual mental health care perspective, for like, can I go to the bathroom wherever I am? Like, do I have to trust that any building I walk into, like I know the people who work there so they can vouch for me if someone complains about me being in the bathroom? Like, that's not a consideration I should have to take when I just need to go pee. And like, there are so many things that add up like that, that become a serious economic impact on people's lives. It's hard to work. It's hard to access these things. And then if you have to travel for healthcare, we see this with the abortion bans as well. And I'll tie those in really quickly. The like attacks on fundamental civil liberties are widespread and also super connected. There's this very gendered and racialized attack. We see it with book bans and so-called like critical race theory attacks, and these arguments that we have to protect people from certain things, and outside of the kind of on their face anti-trans legislation. We also see the Kids Online Safety Act, which is a federal bill right now, claiming to protect children from things that they might be exposed to online, which is, you know, on its face, a very worthwhile cause. It has a ton of support. President Biden signed on to it. The people who first introduced and supported that legislation did so to, quote, protect minor children from the transgender in this culture, and have named social media as a place where children are, quote, being indoctrinated. And so with that context, we see this widespread notion that children and other people in this country are in need of protection. But it becomes really clear if you know, think about it beyond that kind of initial headline story, that we're only talking about certain people being protected with that kind of thing. We're not talking about queer kids. We're not talking about Black and brown kids, immigrant children, poor children. Like, there are so many other issues that are going on that these things are masking, that these things are taking attention away from. And they are not only just like unnecessary laws in some ways, these, you know, anti-trans attacks, but they're not dumb. And I'm kind of hesitant to say that kind of thing, but it's a really intentionally put together attack by a group of really well-funded, smart political people who are trying to take away a tremendous amount of rights and increase the, you know, amount of oppression that's happening in this country and beyond. So you know, putting that all together, I guess, like, we see these book bans and we see attacks on kids being able to use their pronouns in schools, and we see people being fired from their jobs, and people like all of these trans issues and legislative attacks connect to this bigger picture of individual mental health, as well as economic stability, financial freedom, and all of that. So super quickly, I wanted to say, like, TransWork is called TransWork because we were founded after people came together with the community. Board members at the Chamber of Commerce who were trans said, we're not doing enough for our community, and what can we do? And the, you know, overwhelming voices said, we need jobs, we need to pay our bills, we need to get food on the table. You know, it would be great to be an entrepreneur and launch my dream business, but like, I don't want to do that. I don't have energy for that. I don't have some, you know, idea that's going to become a business. I just want to like deal with getting a job under capitalism the same way that everyone else is. And like, we're not going to pretend that that's easy for anyone, but getting that kind of like, you know, equitable traction into like, you'll actually be received as a human being when you go into this job interview. Like, that kind of stuff goes really far, we think. And so that's where TransWork's name came from. We're not trying to say that trans people have to work, or any, you know, individual's autonomy or anything is dependent on their, you know, capacity to work or their status as a laborer. But that, you know, given our economic system that we're aware of, working and engaging with these, you know, economic processes can grant you a lot of different things, and that kind of economic empowerment is really valuable. So we're going to do our best to bring that to as many people as possible, you know, while we're fighting this bigger fight as well.
Thank you so much. And you're getting shout outs in the chat from JN, who's saying, thank you, Sydney, for not shying away from this difficult conversation and speaking candidly about how dangerous it is to navigate being trans in the US. It is important that people know what we are undergoing. So I think, thank you for sharing all that. And I think, yeah, I'm just thinking, it's very hard to apply for roles and advance your career to when you are being systematically oppressed. Like sometimes there's bigger things to think about than, getting that next job. But at the same time, as you're saying, that next job also supplies that economic stability. So hoping you can go into a little bit more detail about what is TransWork doing for trans, non-binary, genderqueer job seekers, and how can people engage with or participate in the program?
Yeah, absolutely. So we kind of get to that point that you just pulled out a lot. And so I'm going to kind of skip ahead to a specific point and then kind of backtrack to the rest of our program. But something that we do in terms of like job preparation workshops and resources for job seekers is talking about questions around things like, do you include your pronouns on your application materials, your cover letter, or your resume? Do you indicate your gender history? So that might be, saying like, my references don't all know me by this name. Like at some step of the process, if you do get hired and they have to do a background check, you do have to disclose your legal name. Nothing is legal advice, I have to say, before I mention anything to do with the law. But we have these conversations really often, and there isn't a good answer about how much to disclose or whether or not there's, a kind of magic key to getting in the door and like as a queer person, because the reality is like these systems are working against us, and it takes a little bit of extra work and intentional navigation of those systems to be able to, get to where we need to be. So we talk about pronouns on resumes, and there was an article that came out about, I think earlier this year, maybe a year ago now, that said if you include pronouns on your resume, especially like they, them, you are less likely to, or you're likely to receive far fewer callbacks for interviews, follow-ups, that kind of thing. And that might be true. I'm not going to contest that point, but I will say that the people who do follow up with you are much more likely to respect those pronouns when you do have an interview with them, treat you well and like a human being if they hire you down the road. And so it can be like a tool for screening out employers and workplaces where you will be at best uncomfortable and at worst face like serious harassment or discrimination. And unfortunately, that is the reality of some workplaces. So we have to think about how we navigate these things. And if you're someone who, I'm here in Philadelphia, I mentioned that already. In a bigger city, there are more employers. You can take some more of those risks if you have, that personal kind of internal calculus of how much, like how urgently do I need to pay these bills? Honestly, I'll speak from personal experience. Before I got the job that I currently have, which is amazing, and I am so incredibly lucky to have, I was unemployed for several months, leaving like a pretty toxic workplace. And I was really struggling. And it got to a point where like I was applying for places that I trusted less and less and less when treating me like a human being, because I just needed to pay my bills. My savings were running out. The like amount of times that I could, call my parents and say, hey, can you buy me groceries again? Like I pulled all the favors that I could. So I would just work anywhere. And we get that. We recognize that. We're working to address things there as well. But there are things that you can do to try to get yourself into those more welcoming rooms that do exist. So
yeah, I was just to jump in real quick. I was going to say, I was seeing at some companies where they were only listing 2 pronouns. So to me, like right away, that's a red flag, like right from the start, that it's like, they're not even acknowledging this in like the application early kind of part of the process. So right away, that's like a red flag too, that I think people could look at and go, maybe this isn't the most accepting place if they're not even putting it in, the very first part of you interacting with them.
Absolutely. And most job listings will have an equal opportunity employment statement. Generally, like you can search for things around like disability because of the ADA kind of requires some things to be listed. Usually it'll be tagged along with that. I'll say like we are an equal opportunity employer for, and then they'll list a number of different identities, protected classes, that sort of thing. And you can look for gender identity. You can look under their benefits section and see some places will say, we will cover transition related healthcare specifically, even if it doesn't fit under our healthcare plan that we have. And like, that's huge. Not every place will do that, but you can look for those things. So looking at the clock, I kind of have to run through some of this stuff. TransWork, and I will put some of these links in the chat for everybody as well. TransWork has a job board on our website, which is transwork.org. That is where inclusive employers can post open positions. It's pretty active. We receive a lot of submissions generally here in the Philadelphia area, but a lot are remote as well. And a lot are in other places because we don't like to put up walls to resources, people who are looking to hire. We also host job fairs, both virtual and in person, that are open to any trans-identified job seeker who's looking to get hired. Primarily, those are with single employers. We have one coming up in a couple of weeks with Vanguard. We had one with URBN, just the Urban Outfitters and Associated Brands parent company. And we're planning other ones with organizations like TD Bank. And we really like to have those job fairs be an event that's not necessarily like your typical job fair. We like to put the responsibility on the employer to say, like, here's why we are the best place for you to come work. We will be the best at respecting your pronouns and making sure that you are included. Like my ideal is that like every employer comes in and like has this most amazing policies in the world, connects people with a variety of different opportunities from like entry-level positions to really, high-level administrative stuff. And then, has someone of trans experience speak about what it's like to be in the workplace. Because as, a trans person myself, I'm hesitant to trust just people saying like, we're super inclusive, woo-woo, go us. But what do you really know? Even if you can read the policies, you don't know what it's like to be trans in that environment. And so we ask that employers, bring someone to speak to that if possible. And then kind of taking a step back from all of that, that kind of assumes that there are inclusive and affirming workplaces for people to enter. We have to take steps to make sure that those places exist. So we host training sessions, again, both virtual and in person for, organizations and employers. Sorry.
No.
Organizations and employers who are, ready to engage intentionally with becoming more trans affirming, wherever that is. So we have employers like wonderful queer-owned bakeries who are like the cutest, most welcoming, wonderful place to work. And they're like, we honestly like don't know what more we could do to be affirming. They come to our trainings to even just practice talking about these topics, to be there as a role model for others. And then we have organizations. We work with a number of nonprofits as kind of referrals for service providers. So workforce development agencies, people who are like hiring on the spot, First Step Staffing and Hope Works here in the Philadelphia area, special shout out, as well as agencies that provide clothing for interviews and new jobs and other components of life, such as the wardrobe, and a couple other healthcare providers in the Philadelphia area, like the Mazzoni Center and Philadelphia Fight, as well as the Colors Organization, which is a Black and Brown HIV focused organization. That's a short rundown of like some of our wonderful organization partners. But we're really aware that like we're not the first to engage with this, even if we're the first to do it out of a chamber of commerce, which brings us a ton of economic resources and connections to corporations and employers and the city government and state government, which I could get into if I had more time. We are not the only people doing this work. I started this job in February and I'm not the first person to engage with this, and I can't pretend to be. And so a lot of what I do is go to organizations in our area and say, like, how can we support you from this kind of more economic side of things if you're a healthcare provider, or if you're this amazing workforce development agency, like HopeWorks, First Step Staffing, a couple others like that. How can we make sure that trans people in your environment are respected, taken care of, affirmed, and as safe as they can be? And most of those conversations look like them saying, like, actually, we already have trans people and they have super, like, what I think of as fairly simple needs and questions that we're looking to have answered. Can you come in and do a training and a job prep workshop and walk through, do you put pronouns on your resume? What are your legal rights in hiring and employment? And really quick, you have a bunch of legal rights in hiring and employment. There are a lot of resources online that you can find pretty easily if you're worried about that. But yeah, we do a whole lot trying to create those affirming employment spaces for people, do trainings for employers. And then we also support entrepreneurs who are launching, growing their businesses, more traditional chamber of commerce type of stuff. But again, with a really keen eye to how we're engaging with things that are visibility focused and empower people through stepping up through visibility, because that's a real kind of different calculus for trans people to make in this current political moment. Like we were talking about before, like being a queer business owner, unfortunately, we've seen in the news is a risk in, across the country. So we don't want to be an organization that requires or asks people to show up visibly and take those risks. It's not something they're comfortable with, but we still want to say there are ways that we can support you economically. So I am looking at time and kind of, running out of some stuff, but my email I will put in the chat as well. If anyone wants to reach out to me personally, it's transwork@thinkiba.com. If you're in the Philadelphia area, we're going to be hosting some networking socials that are free and open to everyone, as well as those virtual events that I was mentioning as well. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that Rob or anyone who's here listening has. And also just thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. We'll be sure to share the URL and your email address in the chat with everyone so they can see that. But thank you so much, Sydney. I love that TransWork is really working on all these different levels, the big Fortune 500 companies, the entrepreneurs, the small businesses, and then directly with people and all these different multi-pathways. And what I'm hearing too is, it is a two-way street. Companies are interviewing you, but you also need to interview the companies, see what resources they have. And I'm glad that you are educating the community in all the different ways, the allies and members of the queer community on this. So I want to thank you so much for being here today. And we're super excited. And I encourage everyone, especially if you're in the Philadelphia area, to check out TransWork.
Thank you all so much. And thank you so much for having me again.
Thank
you.
A
wonderful summit, and wish you all the best.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And